Hello, we're working on Chapter 15 in this video, and we're going to begin right here at the beginning by just taking a quick look at some of the topics that we're going to be working on. Now, those of you that have had other programming classes like our Intro to Programming or Advanced Programming, where you work with Visual Studio and immediately you work in a graphical environment, some of this will not be new to you, but you're going to see that we use a different approach in Java when we're working with some of these, but there's a lot of things that are similar. All right, so the whole point is really writing programs where the user can interact graphically with what's on the screen, and then writing programs that react to those actions. And that is all called event-driven programming. We will have different ways that we handle events, whether it's a button or a radio button or a text field or what have you. And then we will have what we call handlers that will address the actions taken and then take those events and basically do something with them. We're also going to look at working with mouse events and key events, and then towards the end of the chapter we're going to be looking at animations, and that material is going to actually stretch us out for a couple more weeks on this chapter because I think it's pretty important stuff to add. So let's get started. All right, so on a basic level, as I just mentioned, we can create code that is going to react to things that a user does on the screen. And so here they give the example of a button click or mouse movement or keystrokes. So those are all basically events that happen on the screen. Now, in terms of how this works on a higher level, you can take a look at this little diagram here and see that we begin by clicking a button, and that triggers what they call an action event. So the button itself is an object, and we're using that button to instigate the event. The event itself is an object, and we call that an event object, and then we run a handler that takes whatever happened and processes the event and basically does something with it. All right, notice the little thing here at the bottom where I highlighted. It says not all objects can be handlers for an action event. To be a handler of an action event, two requirements must be met. The object must be an instance of the event handler class, basically, and the event handler object handler must be registered with the event source. And you're going to see how that works in a little bit, but basically it needs to be able to react to the particular action in order for it to be eligible to do the work. At this point, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the code here. This little example program, adds a couple little elements here. So the first thing that we're doing that's new is that we're setting up a button, and you may have done that before, but you can see we have a button, we're calling it BTOK, it's a new button, and then we're throwing in a handler for it. So here the type is OK handler class, and it's interesting that they have one set up just for OKs. And then we're giving it a name, creating a new instance, and then right away we're setting here the button OK set on action, the handler. So that will allow us to interact basically with whatever triggers that button. All right, so then we repeat that process for the cancel button. So the cancel button also has a pre-built class, cancel handler class, and we create a new instance of that, and then we also set it up so that it can basically respond to it. You can see then in the pane, we're doing the get children, add all, so then we add those things to the pane. And then we come down here and you're going to see something different, and that is we are actually creating another class inside of our file. And notice that this class implements the higher level libraries here and whatever attributes it has. So the OKHandler class implements event handler action event. We do our override, and then we're just going to throw up a message as a result of it. So we do a public void handle the action event, and then we throw in the letter E there to make it go. And we just are outputting some text, and then we're throwing in another one for the cancel button being clicked. Now, clearly you can run a whole bunch of stuff nestled inside of here once you get it working, but the point of this is to demonstrate how it works. Now, I'm not going to bring up the sample code for this particular exercise, but as I go through I might bring up particular ones for demonstration. But what I would encourage you to do is, if you want to do that, you should pull up the source code from the book, pull up Eclipse, have it running, and then pause the video at key times, drop in the code, it's already written for you, and then try the examples, and if you want you can fiddle with the code a little bit and see how it goes. But getting your hands on it and working with it, I believe, is pretty helpful. All right, they do a little bit of an explanation here about what happens, which is essentially the same thing that I just did, maybe not in as clear a fashion as the book, but you can read the book for yourself. All right, and let's move on to the next section here, and this is about events and event sources. And it says an event object is created from an event source. So it says firing an event means to create an event and delegate the handler to handle the event. We kind of have already said that, but this is really indicating where the event is coming from. So is it happening as a result of a mouse event, or is somebody pressing a key? Is somebody providing some sort of an input? Is there some sort of action that's occurring, or is there something that's happening with the window? Now, all of these fall into that category of event. An event is part of an event object. So when you are invoking a couple of imports or libraries to work from, the ones that we're going to be working with will be the event object, and then also the event. So this is a utility library, and then this is actually an event library. So that's kind of important to know that you're going to see these two very often within your code. Okay, a little clarification here. I have highlighted here at the bottom of the page, it says an event object contains whatever properties are pertinent to the event. So what's going to be pertinent to the event is also going to be relative to the type of thing that you're doing. You are going to see this little snippet here, this method being applied where we get source, and that pulls in the instance method in the event object class. So that's kind of important. We also trigger what we call an action event, and that is triggered by wherever the source is coming in, basically. I'm not sure how else to say it more clearly. Notice this little note he has here. It says if a component can fire an event, any subclass of the component can fire the same type of event. So, for example, for every Java FX shape, layout pane, and control can fire a mouse event and key events, since node is a superclass for shapes. So if I have one object inside of the other, or one draws from a different one to pull in some of its properties, we can still use those to trigger events. And I think that's pretty intuitive, but sometimes it's nice if it's just explicitly stated. Now this next table here shows a complete list of some of the things that we can do in terms of the type of thing that a user does on the screen, then the object that's related to it, and notice with all the mouse and keyboard ones, there's not necessarily an object related to it. Now, pressing the button on a mouse does have a source object, and then some of these are basically repeats. So in other words, all the mouse ones fall into these categories, and notice how we grab onto the event handler. So on button, we're doing a set on action, and that's true for most common form fields. And then we do our event handler and what we're going to do, the action event. On the mouse ones, we do set on mouse and then enter another keyword there. And you should be familiar with these from other languages like JavaScript. And sometimes they are called slightly different things, but I think that's very intuitive as to what they do. And then, of course, we can also respond to key presses on the keyboard. All right, so we have our event on the screen. The user comes along, they click a button, click OK or cancel or whatever it is. And then we take the handlers that have been assigned to those events and do something. Now notice the little bits I have highlighted. I think they're pretty important. It says a handler is an object that must be registered with an event source object, and it must be an instance of an appropriate event handling interface. So it will draw some of its properties, basically from a higher source if you want to look at it that way, but it has to be attributed directly to a particular object that's grabbing the event. So they have to link up basically, and they're calling it registering. And it says Java uses a delegation-based model for event handling. A source object fires an event, and an object interested in the event handles it. So the point really is, if in the past you've seen those as separate, or seen those as one thing, like you click it and it just does something, the truth is that here we have the button that accepts the click, and then we have the handler that does something with that click. So keep that distinction in mind. Really, all the other languages you've worked with actually work the same way, but here they might make much more of a point of making a distinction because it gives you basically the flexibility to do a lot of different things. All right, and they have a couple of criteria here. It says as the handler object must be an instance of the corresponding event handler interface. All right, and that would seem to be pretty intuitive, I think. And the handler object must be registered by the source object, and that's really kind of the key, and that's the whole point of registering. So in order to be able to access that handler, you have to make that connection, basically. We call that registering. Now they go through this little diagram here. If you want, you can take a look at it. But it shows, in essence, how it works. So here we have a user action. So the user, let's say, clicks the button, triggers an event. We have something that listens to the event. Okay, and that is pulling in from the listener class. And then we have an event handler that is attached, basically. So here on the next one, it says a generic source object. I'm sorry, that goes to the top one with a generic event T. So that's the generic form. And then in this one, we are doing basically the same thing, but we are just reacting in a slightly different fashion. So notice here that we're using a generic listener class, where here we are actually setting up a custom one to handle things in a particular method. And then as a result of that, we also have a particular action event that happens. And you don't have to worry about memorizing that information, but I think as you work with it, you'll see kind of the distinction of what is used and where. Now, one thing that you're going to start seeing in the code is approaches like this. So we start out by creating a button, for example, and then we put in, and notice it's going to be an OK button, and they actually have a handler class that's set up for OK. So OK handler class, and we create a new one, and then based upon that we're running the method set on action. And if you remember from that table we looked at, that's the main method you use to trigger events. Then we're going to work with handler 1, whatever that may happen to be. Now, here they have a little bit of an example coming up where we are able to control a circle without event handling. So they have a little sample application here, and I'm going to go ahead and pull that up. So I'm going to pause for a moment while I bring up Eclipse and get everything ready. All right, so now I have my files up in Eclipse. So Eclipse is open, and I'm going to go ahead and do a... And actually, we should be able to just open this now that I think about it. Let's see, it's control circle without event handling. So let's just pull that in and take a look. It's the same code that's in the book, just making sure there's no underlines of problems. But let's see how this application operates. Let's click Run.